Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here. So David somewhat already answered the question of why me, because relative to the man sitting next to me, I've not accomplished nearly as much and don't deserve to be on the stage with him in many ways. But he did talk about my investment in Tiny Pulse, and which I learned about through Stitch Fix, and Margaret Wheeler is here in the audience, who's the head of people at Stitch Fix. She's speaking in, I think, 2 speakers from now, and I think she'll have a lot of awesome things to say about the dark cultures inside of cultures. Is that right, Margaret? Yeah, okay. So that's one reason why I'm here, is my association with Tiny Pulse. But the second one is my relationship with Howard. I've known Howard for the better part of 30 years. Back when I was in college at the University of Washington, I met him through his son, my roommate, and ever since then he's given me a ton of wisdom and advice. And my hope in our 1 hour here is to tease out some of the things that you may or may not know through reading his books, that's books plural, and his speeches and what have you. I would also like to say that I asked Howard if he'd like to prepare with me for this. He said, no, I don't want to know what you're going to ask. I don't want to be prepared for it. So this is actually kind of a live fireside chat. So hopefully it will go well. We have 1 hour, and as I think David knows, has said, if you want to ask questions, I'll keep looking at my cell phone every once in a while. I won't promise I'm not doing email on it. And if you have questions while we're going, I'll take a look at that. I'm hoping to cover leadership, culture, and even a little bit of business career advice as well from Howard, because he has so much that actually, as I think about it, 1 hour is not very long. So I'll start. Without further ado, it's my honor and pleasure to interview you and talk about many things. So what I want to do is I want to start in the beginning. So let's go way back in time. Furniture sales. Furniture sales all the way to Starbucks VP of Operations, to Starbucks International, starting that, and a lot of people think taking Starbucks to Tacoma was a international adventure, but it's not. It's Tokyo.
It was.
Yeah, right. To Tokyo, to Singapore, to the UK. You retired, you came back to Starbucks to be president of North America, and then you retired again, and here you are on stage having written several books. So when you were starting your career, did you know this was going to happen? I mean, did you plan this out? I mean, how does it happen?
No, I didn't plan it out. Of course not. But I did have, I had goals. In the early days, I didn't know what a goal was, so I had dreams, right? And then Jim Jensen, the guy that David was talking about, said, you know, if those things really matter to you, you have to write them down, and they have to have more meaning. And so they became goals. And in my mid-20s, I was trying to figure out who Howard was, and it talks about it in the book, and because of something that happened in my career. And so I went on this journey of trying to paint a picture in words of myself, what my values were, what my mission was, how I wanted to live my life, and what I wanted to accomplish. And so I started writing out 5-year plans for myself, and then I tricked my wife into doing the same thing with me. She's a social worker. You know, her idea of a 5-year plan is, you know, what am I going to do today or tomorrow? Because she has to live in the moment. She deals with people that are dying of cancer. So you're not thinking about tomorrow or next year. So, but she did it. You know, she decided, okay, I'll humor him. And so then we started to develop these 5-year plans for our marriage and for our family, and that became a driving force in my life. So I knew that I wanted to lead a company, you know, and I had goals about how much I wanted to make and my spiritual life and things like that, but I never had never saw this coming. You can't predict this stuff.
So leading a company was in the plan?
Yeah, leading a company was in the plan. And I had, before I joined Starbucks, I had a list of things that I wanted the company to represent, what I wanted the values of the company. And I used to do it at Starbucks back when they only had 5 bar stools in the store. And I'd go get in those days I was drinking cappuccinos. And I'd written out all the things that I wanted in the company that I wanted to be part of. I was trying to buy a small company at that time. and I met this young guy named Howard Schultz who had just bought Starbucks from its founders. He'd been an employee. And so I went and had a meeting with him, a breakfast meeting, and he had a list of the things. He was looking for a VP of operations. And he had about 10 items on that list. And the first thing, he wanted somebody with a college degree. I didn't have that. The second thing, he wanted somebody that had food service experience. I didn't have that. By the time we got to number 10, that was the only thing I could qualify for. I could breathe.
Yeah.
And so we shook hands and parted ways, and I never really got to talk to him about my list because he was the guy hiring somebody, and so
he wrote you off.
He wrote me off, and I wrote him off. And a year passed, and by accident, I found a company that I wanted to buy, and it was a franchise. And a guy that had been working to help Howard, one of Howard's first investors, a guy named Jack Rogers, had franchise experience. And the only place I knew to get money was my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law said, I want us to go talk to this guy named Jack Rogers. And I didn't know that Jack was at Starbucks. And so we went and met with Jack at the Starbucks building. And I sat down and I said, Jack, this is what I want to do. And he looked at me and he said, what do you want to do that for? We need a guy like you right here at Starbucks. So my brother-in-law's sigh of relief, he could have heard down to Auburn, because he wouldn't have to loan me any money if I found a job. And my sister would be happy, you know. So I said, well, I'd already been through this journey and a year ago. And he said, no, things have changed. We still haven't filled that position. So I met with Howard again, but this time I got to my list, what mattered to me. And what was so amazing is that our lists were almost identical, that I wanted everybody in the company, if you worked in the company, I wanted you to be able to vote in your area of expertise. I now call it the person who sweeps the floor should choose the broom. And so, I asked if I could work in the company for a week for free, and I did that. And by the end of that week, I knew it was the right place for me, and he extended an invitation for me to join Starbucks. But never in my wildest dream did I ever think I'd get to a place like Starbucks, nor did I think that Starbucks would ever become what it became. I was trying to escape corporate life. And, I enjoyed this little tiny 28 stores, and I thought it's going to be a nice little company, maybe Oregon, Washington, maybe California, maybe British Columbia, that'd be it. Little did I know what it would become.
Wow.
So you cannot plan it out like we talked about, right? You start going down the tree and you go down the branches of the tree and something blocks you. You get to the end of the branch. No, I go someplace else, and that was my life. But I did know who I was and what my values were, and I had to work in organizations that represented my values.
So should everybody here have a 5-year plan?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, if you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there. And, I always get pushback on that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but then I'll pass by opportunities that, I don't see because I have, no. Part of your 5-year plan is to be able to be open to opportunities, right? But, you should have a picture of words, a picture of yourself in words, who you are, what your values are, what's your personal mission statement, what do you want to leave behind, how do you want to live your life, and your values, that's the most important thing, what matters to you, and that should be part of how you work. There should be absolutely no gap between who you are at work and who you are at home in terms of values. If there is, something wrong. And if there's a gap between you and the person you're spending your life with, there's something wrong. That's the most important thing. You won't be exactly the same, but there should be real commonality between you and your significant other or you and the organization you're working with.
Wow, there's so many jumping off points from that. Thank you. Well, one of them that comes to mind is the culture that you were looking for at Starbucks. And when I failed to mention this, I worked at Starbucks for 4 years in the early to mid 90s. Well underneath Howard. I was a store manager. And I was impressed by, when I got there in 93, how deeply inculcated the culture was and how a lot of decisions were made through the culture. Like, I remember firing more people than for lack of culture fit than I did with lack of skill fit. But people in this room are responsible for culture, whether you're a CEO or a head of people or even running your own division. How was the culture already there, or how did you help get the culture to be more aligned with what you thought would be the best culture for, in this case, Starbucks?
Well, the core of the culture was there. The coffee business by its nature has this mystical kind of culture. It's kind of soulful business. But it was, in those days, it was really all about the coffee. You know, everything, you know, Howard would come in and say, oh, his favorite quote, we got to have more coffee signals, you know. And it used to drive me nuts. I said, what more do you want? We could put coffee on the floor. You want it on the walls? What is it you want? You know, but it was never enough for Howard, more coffee signals. And from the day that I got there, I was trying to convince Howard that it wasn't about the coffee. That coffee was important, but what it was about was the people. And that we weren't in the coffee business serving people, but we were in the people business serving coffee. And a small play on words, but that's what I believed in. That was part of my list. And so I drove that in the organization. And I was relentless about that because I really, truly believed it. That, you know, I don't care what you do in life, it's always about serving another human being. Whether you're in the widget business, whether you're in the coffee business, whether you work at Tiny Pulse, whether you're an engineer, an architect, a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, doesn't make any difference what you do. There's only one reason you're put on this earth, and that's to serve another human being. So that's what I was trying to get across at Starbucks. And I kept pushing that, and slowly but surely, you know, people signed on to that. And, you know, see, culture is a direct reflection of who you are as a human being. It's a reflection of how the leaders act. Not what the leaders say, but how they act in accordance with what they say. Because, you know, how many times have you heard a leader say, people are our most important asset? Well, people, I think that's bullshit. People are not assets. Okay? Assets are trucks and computers and buildings and things like that. You own assets. You don't own people. Assets pretty much always give you what you expect. As long as you put fuel in the tank of the truck and you maintain it, it's there. But people never give you what you expect. You know, ever. You don't give yourself what you expect, you know. So, you know, and culture is a reflection of the people that lead the organization and how well they live up to what they say, how their actions match their words. And, you know, we live in a city here in Seattle, if you're all from Seattle, right? We have lots of different cultures, and they've changed from time to time. Let's take Microsoft, for example. Microsoft had a shitty culture. It was a very successful organization, but its culture was abusive.
I worked there. I could vouch for that.
And it wasn't that Bill Gates or Steve Ballmer weren't smart. They were. But they were abusive to their people. They would yell and scream and put their people down. And so they paid a deep price for that. Look at how many years their stock was flat and people were leaving the company. And a guy that had been there becomes the CEO, and all he does is turn, the culture is now a reflection of him. What's his name? I forget. Yeah. Huh? Yeah. Anyway, he basically...
That guy.
Whatever. Yeah. So anyway, he turns it around by having it follow by living his values. And now people want to work at Microsoft again. And the only thing he did was change how people were treated. That was it.
Well, can we talk a little bit more about that? I mean,
Yeah.
there's probably people in the audience who are thinking about the culture in their companies and thinking, well, we may want to change it. Changing the culture at Microsoft is probably a monumental task.
Yeah.
But how do you change culture?
You got to change yourself. It's real simple. Whatever you want the culture to be, like I say, it's a reflection of you and the leadership team, and particularly the CEO of the company. And so if you want to change the culture of the company, change how the CEO acts, not what the CEO says, but how the CEO acts. And if there's a gap, right, people go to what people do, not what they say. And so, you know, the CEO has to work on him or herself and has to be clear about what their values are and how those values they're just values, are just words until you turn them into actions. And what are those actions that, you know, so if what happens, let's say that somebody screws something up. What happens when somebody makes a mistake in the company? That's if let's say that they get chastised publicly, and there's lots of places that that's what happens, then that's what the culture becomes reflective of, right? If the CEO goes into in a meeting and says, you idiot. Can't you get anything right? I told you what to do. You got to do better. Then that becomes the culture, right? Versus if the CEO in public says, let's work on that. Maybe I can help you with that, or we can make it better. That becomes the culture. And so what is it that you want? And then act on what you want, but it has to be consistent. It's exactly the same thing that goes on in a family. How do you want your kids to behave? They're going to watch what you do, not what you say. And it's exactly the same thing in organizations. So in order to, if you want your kids to behave in a way that's reflective, that is different than what you're doing, then change you. And that's what you got to do. It's that simple and that difficult, because it's really difficult to change yourself unless you really want to. And if you want to change yourself, then you got to really be authentic and vulnerable. You got to open up yourself, and you got to say, if I reviewed somebody, it was always somebody, I always said, okay, you're going to review me. This is a two-way street. We're going to talk with each other about what we can do better to support each other. And that's the way that it had to be. And so that's what I try to build. But it's really simple in idea, difficult in execution, because it's difficult to change self. You have to really be introspective. You got to be willing to be coached. You got to be willing for somebody to open up yourself to people saying, "Hey, what you did was not in keeping with what you said you wanted us to be." And that's what it takes.
Okay. So for a CEO, if you're a CEO in the audience, that's great advice. If you're not a CEO and you are not in charge, you gave me a piece of advice one time I'm going to share and have you expand on, which was choose your boss.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it's very difficult, as many of you probably know, to change who your boss is as a human being, right? It takes a lot of guts to even talk about it, doesn't it? To go into your boss's office and say, you're just not living up to what my expectations are of you.
Actually, to stop right there, the other piece of advice you said is I remember this, is treat your job like you don't need it.
That's
so I think
right.
both of those pieces actually are linked.
Well, you have to be willing to do that. If you have to, huh?
What do you mean willing to do that?
You got to be able to look at the fact that you don't need your job, that you can find another place to work. You got to believe enough that you can do it. If you operate out of fear, then you're never going to be able to get done what you need to get done in an organization. You got to operate out of the belief that you're capable, that you're a good human being, that you're capable of getting done what needs to get done, and that you got to be fearless. It's, as Ray Kroc used to say, you got to turn your fear into faith. And so you have to have faith about yourself. And so when something's not going right and you need to be able to talk to your boss, you need to be able to do it. And if you can't, then you better think about whether you're in the right place. It's exactly, if you can't have a conversation like that with your significant other, your spouse, you better be thinking about whether this is the right spouse or significant other to be with. And sometimes when you go to talk, right, it creates a conflict. You got to always do it with love in your heart. Right? It always has to come from that place inside you, that you love that person and you're trying to help them and at the same time help the organization or help your marriage or whatever it happens to be. But it's always got to be done with love in your heart and done in the right way. But you got to be willing to go into that office and talk about the things that you believe in, the things that need to be changed. And there's always a risk with that. There's a risk of rejection, the risk of getting fired. I've been fired for that.
Really?
Yeah, I worked at a company called Gold Key, and I worked for a guy named Erwin Greenwald. And Erwin was about 6'7", and you'd go in and if you had a conversation with Erwin, you were looking at his chest or looking like this, And Erwin, every day he would come into the office and he'd look at me and he'd say, "Hiya, dummy, how you doing?" Honest to God, every single effing day.
Was he a direct report? Were you a direct report?
I was a direct report. Okay. He was a senior vice president of the company. I was a director of merchandise.
Words of wisdom for everybody
and
to write down.
One day he came in and he said that to me, and it just pissed me off. And I got up and I went up to Irwin and I said, Irwin, don't you ever fucking say that, excuse the expression, don't you ever say that to me again. Ever. I am not a dummy. 2 weeks later, I was fired. But the facts are that, was Irwin a bad guy? He actually wasn't. But he didn't know how to lead people and how to lead. And I just got to the point where I couldn't deal with that. It was being disrespectful to me. And he may have thought he was joking, but it was serious to me. And nobody was going to call me dummy. If I'd screwed up and if I deserved to be fired because I'd done something that shouldn't have been done and whatever, then fine. But not that stuff. And so, you got to be willing to do that. I used to have battles with Howard, over things. If Howard didn't like what you're doing, he'd just say, you're just not a coffee guy. That was his way of shutting you down.
Right.
You're just not
a coffee.
You're not a coffee guy. I was there about 6 months, and you remember Jack Rogers, the guy that got me into the place, right? So one day we were in a meeting, about 30 people or 20 people around the room, and Howard, classic entrepreneur. He's a great guy, but classic entrepreneur. He always wanted to. Focus was not his best attribute, and he came in one day and he wanted to buy this company, and my question to him was always, Howard, what business are we in? And he just looked at me and says, you're just not a coffee guy. You don't get it. It pissed me off so much. I walked around the table and I got right to his nose. And I said to him, don't ever fucking say that to me again, Schultz. And you should have seen the people move from the table. Jack Rogers got up and he grabbed me and he said, go sit down. But you got to be willing to do that. Or in your way,
maybe not that way, right?
But you might not want to use that language, but I had a father that used that kind of language, so I was used to it. So, but you got to be willing to do that, and so those are the things that create culture. So, and Howard and I had a good relationship, but after a while, people knew that I had the ability to go into Howard's office and say something other people couldn't do, because they wouldn't take the risk. And that's why I say, bet your job. I didn't need a job. I loved Starbucks as much as Howard loved Starbucks. I started when there were 28 stores. It was as much my company as it was his. Now, he was the main man, certainly. But I loved it. I loved the people, and I loved what we did. And I still love it today. So the culture of Starbucks was a direct reflection of the leadership team.
So let's talk about culture. I could still almost recite verbatim the 5 values that were intact back in the 90s, which have morphed since then. But one of them in cultures that are trying to be inclusive is decision making. Yeah. You get bogged down in decisions, or it's not clear who the leader is because you want to be inclusive to everybody. But sometimes you need to move the business forward. So how do you manage, as leaders of companies, manage that tension where you want to be inclusive, but you need to move the business forward?
Well, like I said, the person who sweeps the floor should choose the broom. The decisions belong at the place where the action is taking place, as much as you can. And that's on both ends of the spectrum. If you're the CEO, there are some decisions that are yours. You wouldn't ask a barista to determine the IPO stock, the price of the IPO, would you? Right? Or how you're going to finance the business. But you might ask the barista, right? So tell me what customers are asking for. What aren't we doing that we need to be able to doing? What aren't we doing for you that we need to be doing? Is our education and development program, is it working for you? And so the decisions, as much as possible, need to be placed where the action is. Not everything is going to get placed. Everybody wants to have input on every item, but you got to have and that was always an issue at Starbucks. I think that we wanted to be inclusive. And we wanted to have people feel attached. The mission statement and the guiding principles were created by baristas, store managers, directors, and officers, working together. And it took a long time. It took us 6 months to get it down. But that was that was participation at all levels of the organization. So it meant a lot to everybody in the organization, and people knew that. But you have to be clear about what you expect. And you got to be clear about where decisions get made and what decisions should be. The problem is, I think the problem arises when officers of the company start to circle the wagons. And it happened when we went through the 2007, 2008 downturn and there were layoffs. And all of a sudden, the officers of Starbucks started to pull all the decisions in. They wanted to circle the wagons. They wanted to make sure that everything was doing right. And that was a big mistake.
Why is that?
Because the problems, if there were problems, they were in the field, right? Where customers weren't coming in as much, all those things. And who knows more about that than the people that are working in the stores? And when you take all the decisions away from the people that are working in the stores, right, then you stop being able to act and react to what's taking place. And you lose track of what really goes on. And I think you start to make a lot of mistakes. So, and that's usually what happens. When fear takes over, right, then bad decisions get made. And the fear of loss, the fear of whatever it happens to be, the fear of making a mistake. And so it took Starbucks a long time to get it back, to build trust again, where the appropriate decisions are made at appropriate levels. I still don't think they do a good enough job of that now. But, it's big company-itis. That's you start to get, you start to gain more fear, and you don't have any faith.
Or risk aversion.
It becomes risk aversion. You don't want to make a mistake. The officers don't want to be, well, one of their people made a mistake, so what do? You start want to make all the decisions yourself. It's a huge error.
But what's the advice you'd give people in the room about trying to break through that?
Well, I would put, I'd create expectations in your organizations where decisions get made and at what level on what subjects. So people know. But everybody should be able to give input.
Into the decision making?
Well, they may not be sitting at a table, but what's Tiny Pulse about? Right? When I heard about Tiny Pulse, when David told me what it was, I didn't even know that you were an investor at that time. God, I said, this is fantastic. Because I can ask questions that I want to know, and I can get it in real time, all the time. And look, everybody, you know what Frappuccino is, right? That came from a barista, a store manager, and a district manager. And it got rejected.
By Howard, too, right?
By Howard rejected it.
We're not in the frappe business.
Didn't want to be in that business. And we ended up pushing it through, and I won't go into all that, the detail of it, but it came from a store. That didn't come from the office, came from a store. That today is a $4 billion business. Right? I can go on and on. About those examples. Those kinds of things come from the line organizations. But you got to ask the questions, and you got to be willing to take input. Right? If all you're doing is saying, well, I got to create everything here, it's all got to be done in the lab, you're never going to know what really works. And you're going to make lots of mistakes. And the people that are doing the work know what needs to be done. You have to have trust in your people. I always believe you give trust before you get trust. You give love before you get love. And that means that you have to trust your people. And if you ask enough baristas or store managers at Starbucks, they'll tell you what needs to be done to serve your customers better. Period. They will.
The front line.
They know. And you got to be out there doing it. And I always believe that you got to do it face to face. But in those days, we were a much smaller organization. So I'd visit stores. That's what I did. I visited stores all the time.
You were always on the road.
Yeah, always on the road. And it's the same way in what we call our support center. The people in the accounting department know the issues. The people in finance or the people in store design or graphics, they know what the issues are. Ask them. Talk to them. They'll tell you. But you got to be willing to do that. And then you got to be willing to fight for them. If I was willing to fight for Frappuccino, we hid it from Schultz. We did.
Secret project?
Yeah, I was told no, and you can't do that by not only Schultz, but the head of marketing, who had product development, and we just did it under the table. Until in 3 weeks, I brought it back, and they were still mad at me, but it was really successful. So in retail, if you got a product that's selling, you never get rid of it, right? So they gave me a chance, and it was a blowout. And there has been one thing after another that happened like that. and that was successful, and not just in the field organizations, but in the support center as well. So now ultimately I was in charge of making that decision. I felt there was another person that was, but I was willing to take the chance and taken the abuse that could have gone with it if I'd have failed, but and beg for forgiveness later, right? But I was willing to do it. The barista can't put a drink in the store, but a barista can take all the things that we had, all the flavors, all the different things we do. A barista could take all those flavors, anything that we had, and make a drink for a person, and they do all the time. Because they kind of experiment on their own, and then they'll tell a customer, hey, I did this and this and this, and it was really good. You want to try it? And they do. And so that's what makes it work. And so, you have to just be clear about it, but you got to be open.
And not be afraid to lose your job.
Yeah, can't be afraid to lose your job.
Okay. So let's talk about another piece of this, which is in your book about wearing hats. Like, I think common wisdom is you wear different hats. You're a father, a spouse, a teacher is what you do in your job. You wear a different hat around your parents, around your boss, around your subordinates, and even especially in today's world where you have to sometimes in some cultures even be more careful about what you say and how you act. But you took the opposite view, which is you have one hat.
Yeah.
So can you explain that?
Sure.
And for those of us that are in this mindset of, wait a minute, I have to have different hats depending on what role I'm in, switching it to the one hat.
Well, as my wife likes to say, she says, Howard, you can wear one hat, I got to wear 30, right? But I'm not talking about those hats. I'm not talking about the hats that we wear in terms of what we do. I'm talking about the singular hat that we wear that defines who we are. Right? That's the hat of your core values, right? That whatever your list of core values is, and how those core values influence the decisions and the actions you make in your life. So my first core value is honesty. So for me, and if I went around this room, we might all have a different definition of what honesty would mean to you. So honesty to me means that I don't lie. Right? That if somebody asks me a question, they may not like the answer, but I give it to, it may not be what their answer, but it's how I feel. Or if, it doesn't make any difference what they ask me. I will tell you the truth. Or I would say, that's not something that I feel comfortable sharing, and here's why. But whatever it is, it has to be out there. And so I wear that hat, but you might have a different definition of honesty. So, I always say, well, I'm not totally honest, because if my wife comes home and we're going to a party in a couple of weeks, and she goes out and buys 3 dresses, and she comes home and she says, let me put these dresses on and model them for you. And I know she likes one of them. I always call it, this is a trick question. Okay. But then she asks the question that I used to hate. Do any of these dresses make my butt look big? If you answer that honestly, you are dead meat.
Yeah, it's kind of raining outside, isn't it?
Yeah,
Look
you
at
are
the weather.
dead meat. But I finally, after being married for 41 years, I answered that question. That one's not quite right on you, It doesn't fit your figure quite right. So, and she still gets mad, but she takes it, there's sometimes we tell little white lies like in that kind of arena. But let's say that you come home and your husband or your wife says, hey, honey, look what I got you. And you know that you got a tight budget. And you say, honey, how did you get that? And they admit to you, well, I shoplifted it. Right? Can you live with a person that you live with that shoplifts?
They're
to
honest.
Bring you gifts? Huh?
Honesty.
Yeah, well,
right.
that it's not. Yeah, they were honest to you, but can you live with somebody that shoplifts? Right? And so that's these conflicts that we have. Can you live with a coworker that lies about results, that fudges the numbers? Right? Can you live with a boss that instead of taking the bullet themselves, they step out of the way when the bullets are flying and they say it was him? Can you live with somebody like that. And so the hat that I'm talking about is the hat that you wear that defines who you are. You ought to be able to get up in the morning, look across the bed from you, and not have to put on your spouse or significant other hat. You ought to be able to go to work, open the door at Starbucks, and not have to put on a Starbucks hat. You ought to be able to go home to visit your parents and not put on your child hat. You ought to be able to go to wherever your spiritual place is and not have to put on your spiritual hat. You ought to be able to wear your hat through everything that you do throughout your life. And you got to be thinking about it all the time. And companies have hats. Company's hat is its culture. It's who they are and how they act. And you have to be thoughtful about it. So that's what I'm talking about. Too many of us live our lives changing our hats. Oh, I better put on my spouse hat because they're afraid of the consequences if they leave their hat on. Or they go to work and they say, I better put on my Starbucks or Tiny Pulse hat because they're afraid of the consequences if they don't put on the Tiny Pulse hat. You know, and that's not a way to live your life. If you want to have a fulfilling life, I didn't say happy. Happiness is part of fulfillment, but a fulfilling life is happiness, sadness, disappointment, all the things that go on in making a complete life. Then you got to be able to wear your hat in your life. And it makes a huge difference. And I try to wear my hat no matter what I'm doing.
Okay, so based on that, there's actually a couple of questions that are very similar here. We could talk about it in terms of hats, but some people are asking, well, okay, Howard, this all sounds great, but if I'm not the CEO, anyone but the CEO, and I don't believe that the company or his or her values align with my values, or I want to change the values of the company, what's your advice for doing that? How do I do that?
Okay. So if you have an organization that you're working within or that you're leading that's part of a bigger organization, change your organization. Lead by your values and be out with those values. In other words, talk about those things within your organizations and how you want your organization to work. And don't be shy about it. And if you're leading your values, if you're leading by your values and your culture and what hopefully you're a servant leader, then that starts to transmit in the organization. Particularly, you got to be successful at doing it. You got to be one of those organizations that accomplishes what it says it's going to do. Otherwise, you don't get to play. Performance matters in this world. But you can change an organization by taking your organization and changing it. Now, it doesn't always work, but I've seen it work more times than not. And you got to be willing to talk about what you're doing. And again, like I say, you got to be willing to perform. But you can change an organization from the bottom up. It's tough. I'm not telling you it's easy. I'm not telling you it's easy when your people come say, well, I hear what you're saying, but Joe, the CEO, that's not what he does. And you got to be able to say, I know that you got to be honest. I know that there's conflict here between what we're trying to do and how the rest of the organization is running. But let's see if we can't change the whole organization by leading our lives in a different way. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But that's what leadership is all about. If you want a positive servant-led organization, then that's how you have to do yours. And you got to be able to take that risk. And if you get chastised for it and you say you can't, and your boss says, we're not going to do that here, then it's time to be looking for another place to work. It really is. Look, none of you need the job you're in. Not one of you. You don't have to have it. I do a lot of speaking at universities, and the kids are always worried about getting a job. I said, is it really a job that you're after? Is that all you want? That's easy. You can get a job anywhere. But shouldn't it align with who you are? And that means you got to do your work, right? Just because somebody says, I'd like to hire, doesn't mean that's where you got to go to work. And it may take you longer to find an organization that's reflective of your values, but you got to do your work. You got to talk to people in the organization. The first question you got to ask them, what happens when somebody makes a mistake in the organization? What are what's the penalty that the people pay? Do they get just chastised in the organization? Do they get fired? What happens? What are the rewards and recognition systems? What happens when people do something well in the organization? What's the recognition and the reward for that? And what are the gaps between their mission statement and their guiding principles, because every company has one now, and what actually happens in the organization? There's always a gap between what organizations say and what they do. So if you're going to choose a company to go to work for, do your homework. Talk to the people that are working in the organization. Don't just talk to the person you're going to report to or the senior people. Talk to the people on the front lines. They'll tell you what the truth is. And so you want to look for the places that most match who you are. They're never a perfect match, ever. You always are going to move a little bit somewhere. But, why not? Why shouldn't you? You wouldn't walk down the street, maybe some of you have done that, and look at a person walking down the street and say, I'm going to marry that person, and not know who they are. I hope you wouldn't do that. So you'd want to know more about that person, and do your values match? And I think we'd have a lot less divorce in this country if people would really spend time talking about what their values are, right? And worrying less about how people looked.
Oh, before they get married?
Before they get married. And it's the same way working in an organization. And
okay.
So
So your advice is control what you can.
Yeah.
Start with you, start with your organization, and talk about it. Take some risks.
Yeah, and try to change it from within. And you'll know whether you can't get there or not, whether the climb is just too hard. But I was able to change organizations, but some places I wasn't able to change. Irwin Greenwald, I wasn't going to change.
So
but I could change Howard, and I could move an organization. Now I was senior in the organization, but I wasn't the boss, and it was a young, small organization, and I could have influence on it. You'd be surprised how much influence you can have. You would be surprised if you're willing to take the chance.
So you mentioned servant leadership, and you're famous for having your wall of quotes, either in your office, wherever your office is, you have this wall of quotes. And I just want to read off a couple that I've seen, which is, I'm number one, life is like a box of chocolates, I eat them all.
You never saw that quote anywhere.
When I'm bored in a meeting, I pull out my cell phone.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Bring a little levity to the conversation. But you do have quotes, and I wanted to have you talk about a quote that comes to mind when you think about servant leadership, or describe servant leadership a little bit more, what you mean by that, kind of tie the two together.
Yeah. Well, one that I love is only the truth sounds like the truth.
Oh, yes.
And that came from my administrative assistant at a company called Thousand Trails. And her name was Lori Christmas. And it was my first time ever being president of any company. Now remember, no college degree. And the guy that was running it got fired. And I put my name in the hat. I wrote a letter to the board and to the CEO, and I said, I'd like to be president of the organization. I think I can fix it. And so, you always got to be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. And so I got it, and I didn't know how much trouble the company was in. And I'm in it about 2 months, and I realized I had to cut expenses. And I never even had heard of the word layoff, but I was going to have to lay off a lot of people. And so I got all my team together, and I said, okay, we got to cut. This is how much we got to cut. Let's talk about where we think we can cut it. And we developed this plan. And this was before computers, and my administrative assistant had typed everything up, and the head of human resources took the plan and went to the copier and made copiers for everybody. But she left, this was on a Friday afternoon, she left the original in the copier. So by Friday, somebody saw it, and by Friday night, the telegraph, telephone, the phones were ringing off the hook, and fear started to, take over. And
it's worse today when you CC the wrong person. And it goes
right,
everywhere, right?
And it was terrible. And so I got the call, I started getting all the calls, and I called an emergency meeting with my team for Saturday morning. And I thought, man, I've been president for 2 months, I'm going to get fired. I'll be the shortest lived president ever. And so I got the team in the room, and I went around the room and I said, so what should we do? And the first two people said, just deny it. just say, just as something that we're talking about doing, but it's not, it's just don't pay any attention to it because it's not the truth. It was just something that was maybe, like that.
That's the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, the Wizard of Oz, yes.
Ignore the man over
Don't
here.
pay attention to the man standing behind the curtain, right? So, and then my assistant who was sitting next to me, she just tapped me on the shoulder, and she looked at me and said, Howard, only the truth sounds like the truth. Only the truth sounds like the truth. And I said, yeah, easy for you to say. But I listened to her and I just said, Lori, you're right. So I called a meeting for Monday morning. I got everybody together, 1,000 people. And I said, okay, here's what's going on. Here's what's going on with the company, and here's what we're doing. And we're going to have to lay off a bunch of people. I don't know today who all those people would be. And I thought I was going to get my lunch handed to me. But one person stood up, and he just looked at me and he said, Howard, I want to tell you something. I appreciate you telling us the truth. And I may be one of those people that gets fired, but I will tell you this right now. I commit to you that I will do whatever it takes to help the company through this transition. One by one, everybody stood up and committed and started to applaud. Tears started coming down my eyes. Honest to God, I think about it today. It makes me want to cry. I mean, what I learned from that experience, I wasn't even 30 years old. And I learned from that experience is that if you trust your people, they may not always be happy, but if you tell them the truth, okay, they will always step up, always. Not every person, but 99% of them will step up. And, that was a big lesson in servant leadership, because servant leadership one part of servant leadership is about telling the truth, and that was one of the most valuable lessons I think I've ever learned in my life. And so I've just stayed with it since. You're always going to get it. You may not like it, but you're always going to get what I consider the truth, and I won't hide anything from you. And I think it made a difference at Starbucks because that's what I was known for, and people trusted me and I trusted them. Another one is care like you really mean it. It's every executive says, I really care about my people. But, what does that mean to them? Are they really willing? Are they really care? Caring is about when you give up something that you really value to help another human being. It may be time, somebody comes in your office and says, I really need to talk to you about something. If all you do is roll your eyes and say, do you really, can't we do this another time? Then they know that you don't care, right? You may have to say something, I hear you, can we meet tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock? Because I got to focus on this right now, but I want to hear you, and I want to give you total attention. That's okay. But caring is about giving up something of you that you really value. So an example at Starbucks, I'll give you probably the best example that I could possibly give you. It was early on, and one day I get a call from a guy named Jim. He was a store manager up on Broadway. And he called me and he said, I need to come talk to you and Howard. Now, Howard knew him really well because he'd been there when Howard was long before I was there. And so I said, okay, Jim, but is there anything that I can handle for you? I thought, well, I can maybe, be executive. I can handle the price. He says, no, I really need to talk to the both of you. I said, okay, I'll set it up. And so we set up the date, and he shows up, and I go get him at the front desk and bring him back, and we walk into Howard's office, and Howard was on the phone. And so we sat down in the love seat and waited for Howard to get off the phone, and we're talking. And then Howard gets off the phone, and Howard and Jim talk because they knew each other real well. And then I'm an A-type personality, I said, so Jim, what can we do for you? And Jim just looked at Howard, and he said, I need to tell you both that I have AIDS and I'm dying. Now, this was in 1989, early days of AIDS. And we didn't know a lot. We knew some things, but we didn't know a lot. And Howard, looked at him, and a tear came down Howard's eyes, and he just said, Jim, God, I'm so sorry. What can we do for you? How do we help you? And Jim said, well, I'd like to work as long as I can work. And I don't know what that's going to be. Now remember, we're in the food and beverage business, and we didn't know whether AIDS was a virus or what it was. And Howard just looked at him and said, Jim, you work as long as you want to work. And if being a store manager gets too difficult, we'll find something else for you to work. But you're here as long as you want to be here and can be here. And then Howard looked at him and said, Jim, how are you going to handle your health care? Once you can't work anymore. And Jim said, well, there's agencies that are developed now that are willing to help us and to give us resources and sometimes a place to live. And Howard looked at him and said, look, even when you stop working, we'll continue to pay your salary, 100%. And then he said, and not only that, but we will pay all your health care costs. We will cover you on our insurance until you pass away. Now remember, I'm 2 months at the company. I had strong values, but never did I thought I'd face something like that. And
yeah, what about the precedent? Does that mean
yeah,
everybody
yeah,
gets
well,
sick?
and so here we were. Here's a CEO, young CEO. We're losing money. Howard was 32. I was 44. And, Howard never run anything before, but he was willing to commit of his resources, knowing that we didn't have the money. But he cared like he really meant it. Now, what kind of message do you think that sent to me? From that moment on, I knew I could do everything I needed to do for another human being inside of Starbucks. That, I could make those decisions. And that message went throughout the organization. And, I'm not going to tell you that Starbucks was perfect, because organizations, as they grow, they start to create rules, which I hate. Right? And everything has to be consistent. Bullshit with consistency. Okay? There's not one person in this room that wants to be treated consistently. Right? You want to be treated as an individual human being. And that's what we tried to do at Starbucks. You have to deal with what is happening at that moment, what that person needs. You can't always satisfy everybody, but you have to at least make an attempt. And that's part of servant leadership. You got to care like you really mean it. And so those are two, to me, of the most important things.
We're getting low on time already, which I knew would happen. So 2 questions, more tactical. The audience has asked, going back to the beginning, 5-year plan, that sounds great. But where do I start? I mean, that's pretty overwhelming to create a 5-year plan when I don't even know what I'm going to do tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm paraphrasing a little bit.
Okay.
But that's one. And the other one is you just said I make time for everybody.
Yeah.
And with email and text and WhatsApp and meetings and everything else, I mean, how does a leader create time? So there's 2 orthogonal, but I want to make sure I got both those questions in.
Let's talk with that time for everybody. I just had this rule for myself, because I hate rules, right? But I had this deal that I would never turn anybody down, ever. I never turned anybody down at Starbucks. I found the time. It had to be after work. It had to be before work. Whatever it took. If somebody called me, now, in those days, first start, we didn't have email, but as email started to develop, people would send me notes. They want to talk to me, or they'd call me up. And if I couldn't do it at that moment, I would find it time. And I carried that forward throughout my whole life. I do it today. If somebody sends me a LinkedIn or a Twitter or calls me or an email, and I give everybody my email address on my cell phone, they're going to get a call back or they're going to email. It might take me time a little bit to get to person, but I always do it, because I feel that if they extended, their outreach, their hand because they needed something, I may not be able to help them or answer their question, but I'm willing to talk to them, period. And that's just something I do, and I've lived by that. And there's times, let me tell you, that, God, can I keep doing this? But I just do.
That's pretty amazing. You've always been available to everybody that I know.
I just think that it's important that's what I feel I'm put on this earth to do. I'm here to serve other people, and that means that I've got to do it. And I can find all sorts of reasons why I can't, or I'm tired, or, I'm sick, or whatever it is, but I just do it. And the other one was, I forgot.
5-year plan.
5-year plan.
Where do I start?
So start with a 1-year plan. So here's how Lynn and I do it. And we did it in our marriage, right? We did it for our careers and for our marriage. So we would go away for the weekend, and we'd a really neat place. The first time we ever did it, we went up to Port Ludlow, and we rented this condo, and we took whiteboards with sheets of paper.
Romantic, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Honey, get your whiteboard. Let's go.
Well, with the pads with the sticky that you can put on the walls and they just stick. but they don't hurt the wall. So we would go and we would create the headings. So we would have spirituality. We'd have, at that time we called it career, now we call it life's work, was a heading. We had monetary goals or economic goals. We had material goals, things we wanted. We
like
had children.
Car, material meaning house, cars.
House, car, things like that, whatever it happened to be. We had our children. We had
so you're basically a 5-year plan should have everything.
Yeah, we had it all across. There might be 10 headings. Then we would go our separate ways. We'd go into different rooms. And we would write on these sheets of paper under each of our headings what our top 5 goals were. We had one we called marriage, what we wanted for our marriage. And we'd write what our top 5 goals were for each of those areas. And then we'd come back in and we'd present to each other. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we'd present to each other. And you could only ask clarifying questions. You know the rules, right? You can't, no judgmental questions. You can't say, what the fuck you want to do that for? Okay.
Yeah.
But you have to say, what do you mean? And so then we would talk about, okay, where were the conflicts?
Between the two of you.
Yeah, where did we have conflicts? Sometimes the conflicts were with the kids. Sometimes the conflicts were in our career goals. And, Lynn was an oncology social worker, so but she didn't, when we got married, she didn't have a degree. So she wanted to get an undergraduate degree, and she got an undergraduate degree in business because I pushed her a little bit, and I shouldn't have done that. And then she decided she didn't like that, and she decided she wanted to get a master's in social work, and she wanted to focus on oncology. And then she wanted to get a PhD. And I'm traveling all the time, and I had my own career goals, and we had to figure out how we were going to do it, because when she was going to school, she wasn't working. And in those days, we didn't have any money, the early days of Starbucks. I was broke when I went to Starbucks pretty much. And
you didn't say that earlier when we talked about the 5-year ascension, but I'm going to stop you there because but when someone in this room wants to create their own 5-year plan, they don't have a spouse, and they're talking about what
you do the exact same thing. You go away for the weekend, or go someplace that you're relaxed.
Bring a whiteboard.
And you bring a whiteboard, sheets of paper, and what are the pieces of your life that you want to set goals for? Right? What is it you want? What do you want economically? How much money do you want to make in 5 years from now? What kind of position do you want to be in for your career? What kind of place do you want to live? What do you want it to feel like? How do you want to enhance your spiritual life? What do you want for your family? You have brothers, sisters? What kind of relationships do you want with your parents, with your brothers or sisters? Right? Whatever it is that you want to focus on, these headings. And then write out the goals that you have. And you can separate them into, if you don't want to do a 5-year goal, do a 1-year plan. Maybe it's 2 or 3 things in each of your headings. And then you take that and you say, okay, let's say that you have a bad relationship with your parents or your mother or your father, and you want to change that relationship. So you say, here's my goal. I want to have a positive, productive, loving relationship with my mother. Okay, then you start to write out, just like you do now in your organization, how could I go about doing that? So I'll give you an example. So Lynn, when I'm Jewish, Lynn wasn't Jewish when, she wasn't Jewish when we got engaged. My mother was Jewish. My mother, to have me marry a non-Jewish woman was like, you got to be kidding me. That was like death to her, right? She wouldn't talk to Lynn for the first 5 years or 8 years of our marriage. Honest to God, would not even talk to her. And we finally said what we called Project X. It was how we were going to change my mother. And we laid out a plan. And we had, a year from now or 18 months from now, my mother is going to not only talk to Lynn, but she is going to love her like she can't believe that she loves her. So what we did was we started inviting my mother's brothers and sisters over for dinner. right? And we'd cook them a great dinner, and we'd talk, and we'd, have great conversations. And every time and honest to God, my brother had 11 brothers and sisters. And every time they'd go back and they would say God, we had dinner at Howard and Lynn's house. God, she's wonderful. Right? And then we did a number of other things, right, that we did. And so, believe it or not, when my mother died, she thought that Lynn was next in line to God. Right? And so it's amazing what you can do, but we had a plan for that specific thing. So you can do it. But, if you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there. Lay out your path for what you want to accomplish. You don't get everything that you want, and maybe some things you decide you don't want.
So do it in short chunks.
Do it in small chunks and get small successes, one step at a time.
All right.
And you figure out how to do it. So it's not complex. It just takes commitment.
So what do you guys think? Howard Behar.